been away from my children.
10 crazy horror villain crossover movies that almost happened. The horror movie genre has seen some of the most iconic villains in cinematic history. Ever since these antagonists made their presence felt, fans have been discussing the possibility of them battling it out with each other. Their wishes have been answered, but it is also true that till the new millennium, such crossovers were mostly restricted to a few rare instances like Godzilla. This changed pretty quickly with the famous Freddy vs. Jason duel, and it was a massive commercial hit. Suddenly, crossover movies became a craze, and Alien vs. Predator followed suit. While there are some successful instances of crossover flicks featuring the iconic characters, more often than not, the idea doesn't materialize. Sometimes after long discussions and efforts, the makers decide to abandon the project, and the fantasy remains solely in our thoughts. In this video, we will take a look at 10 such intriguing examples where some wild ideas almost became a reality. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Michael Myers vs. Pinhead. All you horror fans must be very familiar with the maniacal masked killer in Halloween, Michael Myers. He first appeared as a young boy who got sent to a correctional home after murdering his sister. He fled several years later and got back to his hometown to slaughter some more innocent people. On the other hand, you have Pinhead, the leader of the Cenobites from the movie Hellraiser, who needs no introduction. His sadomasochism and love for pain and torture made him a fearful entity that attained a cult status over the years. The two were supposed to pair up for a classic crossover that ultimately did not materialize. The idea of putting together the two horror legends was first floated by renowned horror director Dave Parker, who is famous for movies like The Hills Run Red and The Dead Hate the Living. Given that Dimension had both the Hellraiser and the Halloween franchise, the idea was pitched to them, but they weren't too hopeful about the outcome. Dave found a nice way to justify the immortal nature of Michael Myers and introduce Pinhead into the plot. According to his version, Sam Hain, the Lord of the Dead, escaped from hell and took over the body of Michael. Hence, he could not be killed, and when people tried to destroy Michael's house, they found the box that summoned Pinhead. Then the battle would begin between the two unstoppable forces. However, such an intriguing idea was turned down because the studio felt that Freddy vs. Jason would also become a failure. It was much later with the success of Freddy vs. Jason that they warmed up to the idea. They planned for Clive Barker to write the script and John Carpenter to direct the movie, but Clive felt that the contest could end up being a bit boring because Michael doesn't really speak, and Pinhead is the veteran of witty lines. John Carpenter had just tasted failure with his recent works like Ghost of Mars, making Myers vs. Pinhead the ideal redemption. Everything was poised for a takeoff, but Halloween producer Mustafa Akkad was against the idea. Even a fan poll strangely showed 54% saying no to the project. Eventually the project got shelved, and Hollywood moved on to try out more exciting crossover opportunities.
You only got away because me powers are weak. I need me gold!
Surrender to me now.
Leprechaun vs. Candyman. The notorious Leprechaun was the primary antagonist in a series of comedy horror flicks that kicked up a popular franchise. He killed anyone who would steal his gold and had the most vile and vicious methods of slaughtering his enemies. Candyman, on the other hand, was one of the most sinister horror villains despite his tragic past. This murderous entity stood tall at 6 feet 5 inches and had a bloody hook instead of his right hand.
Come with me and be immortal.
He would mutilate his victims and haunt the land where he was wrongfully executed many years ago. There was a time when these two deadly villains were scheduled to face off in a crossover movie that would further each franchise. Leprechaun and Candyman were widely popular among horror fans during the 80s and the 90s, but the success had dwindled in the recent past. Some regrettable sequels had spoiled the fun for both series, and it was time to have a solid entertainer. There were some serious talks about having this project rolling, and Tony Todd, who played Candyman, was even handed a script. However, he had immense love for the character, and he felt that the seriousness would be polluted with the crossover for commercial purposes. His refusal might have actually averted a disaster here, because the only reason that the makers considered doing this was because the same studio owned both franchises. There are hardly any common grounds between these two characters, and two completely different villains would have looked absurd fighting each other. While it might ignite our curiosity, it is probably for the best that the two never came together in some random narrative. Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. In 2003, Freddy vs. Jason proved to be the king of crossover ideas. Freddy was the evil spirit of a serial killer who would murder his victims in their dreams. His gloved hand fitted with razors is a scary sight for those who have watched A Nightmare on Elm Street, and his murders in the dreams would cause the victims to die in real life as well. Jason was the mutilated killer from Friday the 13th who slaughtered unsuspecting campers. It was a kick-ass idea to pit the two against each other, and it was a huge hit as well. As a sequel for this movie, there were plans of introducing Ash Williams, the protagonist from the Evil Dead series, amongst them. The story was supposed to be a direct follow-up, and work had started for a project called Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. For a major part of the film, Freddy Krueger would exist as a disembodied entity that would trouble Jason. He would require the Necronomicon to reconstitute himself, and it would grant him absolute powers. But how would the plot bring in Mr. Ashley Williams? Well, do you remember how the Necronomicon from Evil Dead 2 featured in Jason Goes to Hell? This was to be the link, and Ash would be seen working at a local store during Christmas. The story was to be premised during the holiday seasons, and Robert Englund was set to reprise his role as Freddy Krueger. While the actor was pretty excited about the project, the studio wasn't all that thrilled. Freddy had just received a bashing at the hands of Jason, and the studio was skeptical about having the horror icon face 2 successive defeats. They felt that the audience would view him as weak, and since it was the most successful franchise, they didn't want to restrict the future opportunities. Bruce Campbell, who was not all that interested in such a crossover, did not think that it was a bright idea, and felt that there would be tons of creative differences to brush aside. All these problems ensured that the idea fell flat on its face, although a comic version of this was created by Dimension. Given the downward trajectory of the franchise, maybe it wouldn't have been all that bad to have a proper storyline and end it properly.
Showtime!
Chucky vs. Freddy Krueger. Chucky is the reigning king of the killer doll genre, and this was a serial killer's spirit transferred inside a doll by the use of voodoo. The doll was small, but it had incredible strength to destroy the victims it chose to attack. Chucky carved a special space for itself, and it wasn't long before the studio started considering ideas where it would face Freddy Krueger. Freddy, like we already discussed, was the evil spirit of a serial killer, and it would all boil down to an iconic clash between 2 deadly paranormal monsters. The Child's Play franchise that featured Chucky has been there for over 30 years now, and it still has a special place in the hearts of horror fans. The creator, Don Mancini, had the perfect idea to blend it with the world of Freddy Krueger. He planned to call it Child's Play on Elm Street and would feature a lot of teenagers being murdered through the narrative. He felt that both Freddy and Chucky had distinct personalities, yet were both good talkers. This would mean that it could end up being a fun double act, and Don Mancini planned to have it like a horror version of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. The story would involve Chucky ending up in a bedroom of one of the houses on Elm Street. This is where Freddy would meet him, and it would start off with mutual respect, as the two would be fans of each other. However, it wouldn't take long for them to realize that there could only be one megavillain in Elm Street, and thus the fight would begin for superiority. While this sounds like a fun idea, there is way too much red tape in the way because the studios are all different. The agreement between the likes of Warner Bros. And Universal is quite unlikely, so this remains only as an idea for now. The Monster Squad vs. Godzilla. The Monster Squad was a unique experience for horror fans. It showed a group of youths fighting the mighty Count Dracula and his army of classic movie monsters. The writer and director already had plans for a sequel, and one of the plans was to give this youthful group a much stronger adversary in the form of Godzilla. The King of Monsters would be more than a match for the brave kids, and they felt that there could be nothing more exciting than the Monster Squad dealing with the most powerful kaiju. We would be lying if we said that the idea did not interest us at first. However, it was also thought-provoking if the contest would prove to be an unfairly poised match. Besides, the box office failure of the Monster Squad didn't do these plans any good. It did enjoy a cult following over the years, but the commercial failure ended any plans of a sequel on these grounds. Recently, there were some talks about the project being revived one more time, but it all seems very unlikely as of now. The director, Fred Decker, has admitted that such a sequel is not going to happen anytime soon. However, it does make for an interesting imagination to figure out how this clash would look like. Godzilla is supremely powerful, and given the fact that he defeats some of the most insane monsters ever, a group of kids would look silly trying to bring him down. Nevertheless, it would require a really good script to make things believable, and we aren't complaining that the project didn't take place. Supernatural and Friday the 13th. Supernatural is one of the most successful horror shows ever, and the third season had a very good chance to involve the hulking slasher Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th. Supernatural is about the monster hunters Sam and Dean as they face various forms of evil in the course of their journey. The idea to make them deal with Jason Voorhees came up, and you would have almost seen it had it not been for some minor issues. Over the years, Supernatural has managed to come up with some outrageous out-of-the-box concepts, and still facing Jason is not quite out there. Besides, you must also take into account that Jason had already been to Elm Street to face Freddy Krueger. While it would have made for a mouth-watering contest to watch Dean and Sam take down Jason, it is tough to imagine a conclusive victor. It would have been the first time that the duo would face an actual horror movie villain that was not specifically created for the show, and it is thus understandable that such icons in a show would disturb the continuity. An even bigger problem would be the licensing fees and long list of permissions that would be required to go ahead with such a project. For season 3 of Supernatural, the idea almost came together, and the story was ready as well. Dean and Sam would head into a dream to save their surrogate father figure Bobby Singer from his comatose state. They would revisit some of his worst memories, and there would be an appearance of Jason who would attack Dean in the dream realm. This would be a tribute to the Friday the 13th franchise, but legal issues never allowed the plan to go ahead. Supernatural is a Warner Bros. Entity, and they also had the rights over Jason movies during that time. However, Supernatural creator Eric Kripke failed to have permission from the other parties concerned, and at the last moment, the idea had to be scrapped. The main Jason rights were probably still with producer Sean Cunningham, and the makers failed to broker a peace between Cunningham, Paramount, and Warner Bros. It surely would have been a cracker of a contest.
Open the door! Oh, shit.
I am the way.
Jay and Silent Bob meet Pinhead. Jay and Silent Bob are not your conventional horror movie villains. They are in fact drug dealers who would be stoned for most of the day. They met as infants, and while Jay has the habit of cussing a lot, Silent Bob is mostly quiet. Jay is more like the leader among them, and their distinct features have made them into an iconic duo. Pinhead, as you all know, is the pleasure-loving leader of the Cenobites. He can be summoned by solving a puzzle box, and he brings with him unspeakable horrors and torture for his victims. So how would it go if the comedic duo faced the dreadful monster from hell? It all started after Hellraiser Bloodline bombed at the box office. Dimension Films was in disarray, and they were desperately looking for ideas to help them revive the franchise. Hellraiser was once a very lucrative property to own, and they wanted to restore its monetary draw. They even went ahead with a few direct-to-video efforts just to remind people that the franchise still existed. When Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back released, the writer and director Kevin Smith was approached by Bob Weinstein. They discussed a possible crossover, and the idea was hilarious. Jay and Silent Bob would find the puzzle box and end up in their hell, which was rehab. Dimension Films was serious about the idea, but for Smith, it was no more than an amusing concept that lacked the detailing to proceed. Kevin Smith even consulted his friend Ben Affleck, who felt it would be a grand success. However, the bizarre idea was never worked with, and while Hellraiser went in some strange directions, even space, it never warmed up to the idea of facing a comical duo. Jaws and Animal House. The menacing white shark from Jaws was probably the worst nemesis in the genre of creature features. The brutality of the shark and the effort it took to get the better of it became a cult classic, and it is no surprise that people started considering a nice juicy crossover. Chief Brody had already fought the threat in the first 2 films, and the producers felt that doing this a third time might seem autonomous for the audiences. Their great grand idea was to lean towards a comedic spoof-like slasher that would entertain the fans. The producers brought to the discussion table the publisher of National Lampoon, who had produced Animal House. The movie was supposed to be called Jaws 3 People O, and Home Alone writer John Hughes was asked to be in charge of the script. The film would be directed by Joe Dante, the director credited with works like Piranha and Gremlins. This would involve numerous Hollywood stars and would have a parody-like narrative making fun of the series. The story was that a film crew was trying to film a Jaws sequel, but at the same time they were being hunted by a great white. There were some hilarious sequences in the mix of things, such as the Jaws novelist being eaten by the shark in a swimming pool. However, there were some serious conflicts with Universal Studios, and the project was shunned. While this brilliant idea was ultimately not considered, the makers went the wrong way, and we had the terrible Jaws 3D. We don't know how this crossover would turn out to be, but it surely would have been much better than Jaws 3D.
To power, yet much to learn. Taller or shorter, I'll make you burn!
Leprechaun vs. Wishmaster. Do you remember the evil djinn from the movie Wishmaster? This ancient evil genie is the main antagonist of the franchise, and he would grant any wish to the victim in exchange for his soul. Leprechaun, as we have already discussed, is the gold-obsessed monster who would kill to get back his gold. The news about the 2 collaborating for a movie could have been speculations, but there is enough reason to believe that such a possibility was being considered. It all started when a fan-made trailer started doing the rounds on the internet. This was an extremely well-cut trailer, and it used clips from both the franchises. While this is not enough reason to believe that the makers were considering an official crossover, the rumor mills were suggesting something like this on the cards. There is some credibility to such news because both franchises were under the same banner. They clearly tried some other Leprechaun crossover ideas before, and this might not be all that impossible. What would have made things more probable is the fact that both these franchises had a similar tone and style. Even the budget was more or less the same, and it would actually be no technical problem to put them together. All we could say is that Leprechaun and Wishmaster would have been fierce opponents, and with the right story, it could have been a very entertaining watch.
Proceed? Well, then just hide your face. We ain't done nothing. There's no It's a bust, man.
Cheech and Chong vs. Jason. It seems like the idea to have a comedic duo take on a dreaded horror icon was being considered time and time again. Cheech and Chong were the stone buddies who entertained in the movie Up and Smoke. These became cult characters, and it was hilarious to watch their antics. Jason needed no introduction, and we have already spoken about the deadly killer several times in this video. The idea to bring them together might sound like chalk and cheese, but it was something that producers considered pretty seriously at one point. The director of Friday the 13th Part 6 revealed in an interview that he had pitched a sequel that included the stoner duo. The hockey mask wearing murderer would be against the Stone Buddies, and the marijuana themed comedy would be the standout feature of the movie.
Damn, I was in that shit, man. I never had no double.
The first movie featuring Cheech and Chong was Up in Smoke, and Paramount Pictures had distributed the film. They also owned the rights to Friday the 13th, and it wasn't too difficult to get such an initiative rolling.
Yo, man, it's cool. It's cool.
Cheech and Chong could be camp counselors or something like that, and it would be a laugh riot as the Stone duo figured out if Jason really existed or was just a part of their hallucinations. Sadly, the film never took place because some of the producers did not take a shine to the idea. It would have been a thorough entertainer, and the audiences would have been reeling with laughter. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.